Sex on Film, Lesbians is a series of conversations between Anne Robinson and 5 women identified only by their first name. 4 are lesbian filmmakers, 1 bisexual. As with my past videos, I will be trying to summarize these statements in my own words. My general observation on this chapter is that while the 5 lesbian filmmakers have sharp distinctions in how they make films, there is overlap between all 5 in how they talk about traditional views of sex, how they view the male gaze, and why they think representations of lesbian sex are necessary. One of the most difficult aspects of reading this chapter is trying to understand their point without watching their films. Given that they are only identified by their first name, I have not been able to identify the 5 people Anne Robinson spoke with for this article. I have included details like the names of their films and filmmakers who inspired them to make it easier for those interested in this chapter to potentially find them. Anne Robinson studied painting at the Glasgow School of Art and studied film at St. Martin's School of Art. The biographies at the end of the book indicate that Robinson makes experimental video and film. The introduction consists of a series of questions and statements which are somewhat disjointed. I am assuming Anne Robinson wrote this introduction. She asks questions like why lesbians and bisexual women would make films featuring sex between women. If a lesbian filmmaker uses, quote, shock tactics, unquote, are they conforming to what Robinson calls a heterosexual viewpoint, the idea that lesbian sex is a perversion? Notice that Robinson calls this the heterosexual viewpoint, not the religious viewpoint or the traditionalist viewpoint. Robinson considers the heterosexual viewpoint homophobic and is asking if lesbian films, which portray lesbian sexual activity as shocking and perverse, feeds into this homophobic view. Robinson argues that because art and film are almost necessarily autobiographical, lesbian filmmakers need to make films which include lesbian sex as a counter to patriarchal films and pornography. If you want an example of a mainstream liberal film which these feminists consider problematic, Robinson identifies the 1983 film Liana as one. In Robinson's view, all mainstream films and pornography featuring lesbians are anti-lesbian and promote homophobia. Let's underscore the key problem these lesbian and bisexual filmmakers are focusing on. To quote Robinson, feminist arguments like men might see it and wank off on it have produced images of desexualized sexuality. Robinson is wondering how lesbians can create sexual films without reinforcing patriarchy and suggests a new subversive language is needed. The rest of the article presents the 5 interviewees' personal statements, one at a time. Kate argues that lesbian film needs to be explicitly sexual, regardless of whether men get off on it. S&M imagery or euphemized imagery are not enough. Kate's artwork is described in what I presume is an editorial comment because it is italicized. Even though the language is somewhat abstract, I think this wording is very important to understand what is going on in this interview. Quote, for some time, Kate has been using images of extroversion and sensuality, women performers taking the power of expression into their own hands, using this combination to portray the reality of desire. This sounds like art placard speak, but what I think this is expressing is the idea that Kate makes explicitly sexual films which are also meant to empower women rather than use patriarchal motifs. Kate expresses her desire not to be desexualized, calling this a Jewish perspective on sex. She argues that boring, desexualized films are essentially for a middle-class intellectual clique. Kate bemoans the lack of analysis of sex on a political level. What exactly is an analysis of lesbian sex on a political level? I'm not sure, but I do see the connection with the slogan, "The personal is political." For Kate, these films have political implications. She names Pasolini's film Salo as an example of a political examination of sexual politics and fascism. I referred to Wikipedia to get an idea of this film Kate is talking about. Salo is a 1975 Italian-French horror art film about 4 wealthy fascists kidnapping and torturing 18 women, apparently based on a book, 120 Days of Sodom, by the Marquis de Sade. From what I understand, Kate sees this sexual film as a critique of fascism, and she wants more films like Salo. Kate thinks a lowercase c Catholic or Christian idea of sex is the dominant one, even amongst atheists and non-Christians. She calls this Christian idea of sexuality a Nazi reflection. Because she is a Jew, she does not want to adopt this Christian-style representation of lesbians and sex in her films. Second is Angie, who identifies as bisexual and says she has dealt with het, gay, male, and lesbian sex in her films, and wants to continue doing so. At the time of the interview, she was working on a film about sex and apartheid in South Africa. Once again, we see these filmmakers are concerned with the politics of their day. Though Angie did not want people to view her movie as merely a gay rights film, she decided that if people came to that conclusion, that was their problem. She then discusses how she almost made a film about disabled lesbian sexuality featuring 2 of her friends at their request. Quote, "They predicted that people would cringe at the sight of 2 disabled women having sex and wanted people to think about why they would cringe, i.e., because it's not a classically romanticized, beautiful setup." In the end, Angie decided it would be ableist for her to make such a film. She suggested to her friends that since she, quote, would not understand the feelings involved, it might be more appropriate for her 2 friends to film themselves. Angie lists several techniques for filming sex and suggests that all of them are capitalistic. In these films, quote, "women's bodies belong to the consumer world." Here we see such a concern with objectification that Angie believed she couldn't film her disabled lesbian friends engaged in sexual activity without using objectifying film techniques. How would it be possible to get around this? Angie suggests that films from the Eastern Bloc countries might offer a new visual language, and she muses that this may be because women's bodies are not used in advertising in the same way they are in capitalistic countries. She reiterates the idea that many films featuring lesbians are designed for the straight male audience and argues for filming sex in a way which does not appeal to that audience. Natural lighting, no focusing on a fetishized part of the body. Angie argues that she wants to see depictions of homosexuality in normal films, not just in gay films or lesbian films. She closes with an argument that as long as there are moral beliefs about sex, some sex will be viewed as dirty and therefore potentially exploitative. She argues that even though it's possible for lesbian sex to be exploited by the male gaze, it's up to people who objectify women to change. She concludes that it's therefore appropriate for her to include representations of sex in her films. Third is Martine, who says she dealt with sex in her films before she was a lesbian, but in a non-direct way, using nights as a metaphor for male sexuality, for example. After becoming a lesbian, Martine says she changed her approach, making more direct films about her sexuality, lesbian fairy tales without men. She describes one which featured her in opposition to a female character, Miss Worlds, who represented the unrealistic women made for the male gaze. The film ends with, quote, 2 dolls in bed. Martine describes an ongoing project featuring 2 women, one traveling in the desert, the other traveling in the sea, until they meet in the end, using fairy tale imagery she associates with patriarchy to represent feminist lesbian sexuality. She says her personal experience with Catholic guilt was important for her films. While she does not like her work being described as lesbian film, she considers this inevitable and argues that representations of alternative sexuality in art will challenge the norm. Martine identifies Jean Genet's film Un Chant d'amour as a film which affected her own work. According to Wikipedia, Un Chant d'amour is a 1950 film with explicit male homosexual imagery, featuring 2 male prisoners performing sexual acts on each other and a male guard abusing one of the prisoners. The Wikipedia article describes one of the prisoners having a fairy tale-like fantasy, so we can easily see how this would inform Martine's interest in fairy tale motifs. While Martine doesn't want men to objectify the sexual acts in her films, she essentially doesn't care how straight men will react to her film. She describes her intended audience as either isolated lesbians or women who are straight but have some lesbian inclinations. Fourth is Sandra, who describes feeling left out whenever she witnessed heterosexual acts in films made by straights. She identifies Chantal Akerman as the closest any straight filmmaker had come at that point to representing lesbian sexuality well. But even that wasn't quite what Sandra was looking for. Sandra believed that lesbian sexuality was about pain, something which straight viewers would not understand. She describes details from her films, including one called Edge, but her description is quite generalized. She identifies heterosexuality as capitalistic and indicates that Western society and institutions of power isolate lesbians. She describes her film on anorexia, titled Arrows, as an example of her dealing with this idea of pain and isolated lesbianism. She describes being sick of intellectual discussions about lesbianism. Here she alludes to a topic in feminism which I do not know much about, but I recognize that it is very important to feminists. Semiotics, or arguments about signifiers and the signified in language. Essentially, Sandra says she's not interested in this aspect of feminist theory in her film. Sandra says that she refused to depict heterosexual activity while working with filmmaker Sylvia Plath. Sandra argues that lesbian filmmakers have to create something, quote, out of silence, by which I think she means that the history of art and film doesn't give lesbian feminist filmmakers much to work with. She describes her feelings of revulsion watching what she calls, quote, male-identified images of women, no hair on their legs, privileged, middle class, Chanel No. 5 women who've got a head start anyway because of class. In my opinion, this is Sandra's way of describing male gaze theory. What I think is noteworthy here is the personal, visceral revulsion Sandra describes for these women based on their physical appearance. To be perfectly honest, I do not know what Sandra is trying to say in her last two paragraphs. She talks about the importance of sex and how she feels like this is a raw nerve, screaming all the time. She wants to show joy and pain in sex, but is concerned with patriarchal norms and, quote, aping sex in heterosexual films. She describes film techniques she does not want to use because of this. Quote, clouds in front of the moon or pans across the beautiful countryside. She wants to show emotional desire without showing two women in bed. In the end, I'm personally left very confused by what Sandra wants and what kind of film she actually makes. The general impression I am left with is that she is deeply troubled by what she considers patriarchal images in film and is not yet sure how to represent what she wants to represent without that kind of imagery. Finally, the last statement comes from Caroline, who says that she originally came from revolutionary feminism. I do not know whether Caroline meant she was once a revolutionary feminist and abandoned the revolutionary aspect of that, or if she still was a revolutionary feminist at the time this article was published. Quoting Caroline, I have a really strong awareness of the way images of women are used to exploit, and sexual images of women are used by men as a turn-on. While Caroline believes that lesbians need to see depictions of lesbian sex in art, she is viscerally angry over this patriarchal male gaze in the culture. Quote, after being involved in feminist filmmaking for a while, I got a really strong feeling that we needed strong images of lesbian sex that turn women on but threatened men. I would like to interject here with an observation. In my last video, we heard how Zena Herbert wanted her sculptures to overawe men and make them uncomfortable. Here, Caroline is explicitly calling for a strong lesbian sexuality intended to threaten men. Quote, because of my anger about the way men exploit women's sexuality, it's a difficult combination, but not impossible. Caroline sees lesbians as marginalized and figures it couldn't hurt to put sex in their films. What exactly is threatening to men? Caroline names the film A Question of Silence as an example of a threatening film, quote, in terms of exclusion. I believe she is referring to the film made in 1982. According to Wikipedia, it concerns 3 women, all strangers to each other, on trial for killing a man who was also a stranger to them. I haven't seen this film, but I would strongly recommend you read the Wikipedia summary of it. Given that it involves the brutal murder of a man by 3 women, seemingly unprovoked, reading the Wikipedia article helped me understand Caroline's point on an emotional level. I am personally deeply disturbed by both the description of this movie and the fact that it is being held up by Caroline as an example for feminist filmmakers to imitate. I would like to reiterate something about this book which I stated in my introductions. Students were taught this. This book was intended as a text for college art students to help them understand the history of feminist art. Here, Caroline is describing how revolutionary feminism is informing her filmmaking. She describes her anger at the broader culture, and she holds up the movie A Question of Silence as an example to take inspiration from. If you are a parent, if you are a person interested in art, if you are someone who calls yourself a feminist or an advocate of social justice, I want you to go read that Wikipedia article. While you read, I want you to ask yourself this question. Is this something that I want my children or any children taught as a positive example of what film and art should strive to be? Regardless of what your answer to that question is, this much is clear. Caroline's view of art and filmmaking most likely was taught to numerous young art students, and the context of this book presents this perspective as a valid feminist perspective. You want my opinion? Caroline is an open misandrist, and this film, called a feminist classic in the Wikipedia article, much like a snuff film, was made by violent and disturbed minds for violent and disturbed minds. So Caroline's angry about male gaze and patriarchy, is she? Well, I am angry about this. How dare these people use the university system to inculcate college students, children, with this perverse, degenerate garbage in the context of an art class. I think this is filth. And I will never, ever stand down or play the male feminist to placate this wicked ideology. That was my op-ed. So let's put that emotion aside and try to wrap up this summary. Caroline goes on about the need for explicit lesbian sex in film and representations of pleasure, even if she doesn't know how to make such a film. The film, At First Sight, is cited as an example of a movie which represents erotic desire without explicit sex scenes. Caroline describes this as a difficult problem because her films do not have narratives. If her films were only about sex, she would hope that only women would ever watch them, denying access to men. Effectively, it's not possible to make the perfect lesbian film, and Caroline is okay with that. After describing the diversity of films in existence, from AAA big-budget movies to indie projects, Caroline argues that lesbian sex is always political. Let's quote Caroline, shall we? One way of using sexual imagery in film could be using powerful contrasting images to create not just a sexual image, but also a strong political threat. She goes on to describe other possible techniques and lesbian in-humor. Of all the personal statements, I think Caroline's is the most charged with incredible implications, and I think I need to quote her closing remarks in full. I'm not thinking about campaign politics as such, but about reality, the everyday politics of life, consumerism, housework, etc., and the actual substance of everyday reality, which is not normally considered political in the way that demos are. So I want to produce images of the reality which have political significance, including lesbian sex. That concludes Caroline's statement. So, what to make of what we've just read? At no point during my time making videos have I become this emotionally invested in my work, to the point that it may be difficult for me to put my thinking cap on and examine this unemotionally. But here is what I have gleaned from what I have read. All 5 of these feminist filmmakers have very different approaches to making their films, both the content of the films and the technique, fairy tale imagery versus naturalistic, revolutionary and political versus emotionally vague and abstract, films for a general audience, including straights, versus films for a targeted audience of like-minded individuals. In all of these statements, however, we can find overlap. First, a deep concern for male gaze theory in general and depictions of lesbianism in film in particular. Second, a desire to make true lesbian sexuality in film in spite of a variety of questions about patriarchy and different approaches to film. Third, a mixture of personal, emotional language and life experiences with political thinking. Of all these statements, however, none was as striking as the overt hatred expressed in Caroline's. As infuriated as I am by what I read, I sincerely believe I do not hate these people. I hate this ideology. But I think I sincerely pity these people. These statements express so much confusion. It's as if they don't even know what kind of film they want to make, but they do know the purpose they are striving for. And whether it is confined to more radical feminist groups or the culture at large, these are artists with a vision for the world. You might laugh at them. You might think their art or their statements are ridiculous, but when I read this, I am confronted by a stark reality. In the 1980s, these people did not have much political or institutional power, but they knew they wanted it. In 2018, this philosophy, or if you don't want to call feminism a philosophy, this set of disparate ideas and resolute political activism has achieved power and influence in places like an art classroom. I want to leave you with 2 questions. A rhetorical question I think I know the answer to, and a sincere question I don't know the answer to. Remember Caroline's words that she was concerned with reality, the everyday politics of life? Question 1. Do you think that art, comic books, video games, and popcorn movies like Star Wars might be included in what Caroline had in mind as part of the politics of everyday life? Yes, of course. I think that is obvious. But here's question 2. How exactly did this group come to have such a hold over how art and art history is taught? And what comes next for this radical feminist politics as described indirectly by several of the feminists featured in this book and as described directly by Caroline? That's the question I don't know the answer to yet. But I know that it is a vitally important question and will remain so for me as I continue to examine feminism and art. Shooba doop ba doo wop doo wop wop wop. who says she dealt